Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of the traditional Christmas nativity to uncover the actual, profound historical realities hidden right beneath all those cultural decorations. I am so excited to guide you through this. You know, we all have this very specific image in our heads when we think of the nativity, right? But what happens when we actually look at the historical texts and the cultural context of first-century Judea? Well, the truth is actually far more fascinating than the myths.
I mean, we all know the familiar scene from the school plays and the greeting cards, right? The mean innkeeper turning away a young couple, the pristine wooden barn, the perfectly silent night. But the historical texts reveal a gritty reality that is vastly different from that. Instead of those perfectly quiet nights, we're actually looking at crowded family living spaces, literal animal feeding troughs, and birth announcements made to the absolute lowest social outcasts of the ancient world.
So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're breaking this down into 5 key areas. First, the familiar nativity story. Second, rethinking the inn. Third, the manger and swaddling clothes. Fourth, the marginalized shepherds. And finally, the real historical message.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, the familiar nativity story.
140 kilometers. To put that into perspective, that is the seriously grueling distance Mary and Joseph had to travel from the tiny hamlet of Nazareth all the way to Bethlehem. The historical sources note this massive migration was driven by a decree from the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus, who ordered a census for taxation. So picture this, a dangerous journey made entirely on foot or maybe by animal across really rugged terrain, heading to a tiny ancestral village that barely even registered on ancient maps. Oh, and of course, Mary was heavily pregnant. A 140-kilometer hike is incredibly hard on its own, but doing it in your 3rd trimester on the back of a donkey? Yeah, definitely not a pleasant holiday road trip.
Which brings us to part 2, rethinking the inn. Now, what's really wild here is how a single word in translation completely changes that famous story of the mean innkeeper. We've all seen the grumpy hotel manager shouting, "No vacancy," right? But the sources reveal a completely different situation. The original Greek text of Luke's Gospel uses the word kataluma, and historical scholars are quick to point out that this word actually refers to a lodging place or a guest room inside a private family home, not a commercial hotel. Actually, when the same author wanted to refer to a public, commercial end, like in the parable of the Good Samaritan, he used a totally different Greek word, pandikeon. Plus, because Bethlehem was such a tiny town, it very likely didn't even have a commercial inn anyway. This distinction is absolutely crucial. In fact, it's such a big deal that modern translations have actively corrected the text. Just look at the updated 2010 New International Version. It now reads, "She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them." See that? The commercial innkeeper is literally removed from the story entirely. It wasn't that they were rejected by a heartless business owner, it was just that the family's guest room was already full.
To really grasp why it was full, we have to look at the reality of first-century Bethlehem. The town was absolutely overflowing because of that census gathering. And in that culture, strict Jewish hospitality laws meant that a pregnant relative arriving in town would absolutely never be turned away. That would have been a massive social taboo. So instead, Joseph and Mary were definitely welcomed into an ancestral home. But because that upper kataluma, the guest room, was full of other relatives, they were forced into the lower level of the house. In typical Palestinian peasant homes at the time, that lower level, or sometimes a connected cave, is where the family's animals were kept at night to provide warmth and safety.
Okay, moving right along to part 3, manger and swaddling clothes. Before we dive into the metaphors here, we have to look at the actual historical practice. The sources describe a very specific first-century Jewish birthing process. After cutting the cord and washing the newborn, the baby was rubbed with salt for cleansing and then tightly swaddled with strips of linen. This detail is super important because it proves that this baby, despite being born in the dirt of an animal enclosure, was deeply, deeply cared for. Swaddling wasn't just haphazardly throwing rags on a baby. It was a very deliberate, compassionate act to provide warmth, security, and proper limb alignment. Now, theologians analyzing these texts point out a really fascinating duality between these physical realities and their spiritual meanings. Take the manger, for instance. It comes from a Latin root meaning to eat. It's literally a feeding trough. So the text is intentionally placing the baby in a food box to symbolize that he will become spiritual sustenance or the bread of life for humanity. On top of that, those restricting swaddling cloths, which physically limit the baby's movement, deliberately foreshadow the linen cloths that would eventually be used to wrap his body for burial. From the cradle to the cross, this incredibly deep symbolism is intentionally woven right into the historical reality. Let's shift gears to our next characters in Part 4, the marginalized shepherds. Think about it. If you were inventing a story about the birth of a glorious new king, you would probably have the grand announcement delivered to the rich and the powerful, right? But the sources do the exact opposite. In first-century Judea, shepherds were actually seen as social outcasts. Because they lived rough out in the fields, they couldn't always observe strict religious purity laws, so they were frequently viewed with suspicion by the settled population. They were known as the Anawim, the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable who sat at the very, very bottom of the social ladder.
And yet look at what the text highlights. This grand, glorious, angelic announcement wasn't delivered to royalty in a fancy palace. No way. The sky lights up, an entire army of angels appears, and they deliver the ultimate VIP birth announcement directly to these marginalized outcasts in a dirty field. The sources make it clear this is a deliberate signal. This event is for all people, but it's specifically targeting the working poor and those who society tends to look down upon. Which brings us to a massively important historical context. The language used in these texts is intentionally heavily politically subversive. See, during this exact time in history, the Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus was out there calling himself a savior and a god, constantly boasting that his military conquests had brought the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, to the world. But the historical texts of the Nativity take those exact imperial buzzwords, savior, peace, good news, and they apply them to a peasant child born in an animal trough. The sources are presenting this humble child, not the all-powerful emperor in Rome, as the true bringer of peace and the actual ruler of the world. It's a huge statement.
So what does this all mean? Let's tie everything together in Part 5, the real historical message. When you look at all these elements combined, the grueling journey, the crowded house, the feeding trough, the peasant swaddling cloths, and the outcast shepherds, a really clear picture emerges. As scholars point out, the source texts go out of their way to absolutely avoid romanticizing the birth. They actively resisted the temptation to make the physical location seem better or cleaner than it really was. By placing the event squarely in the dirt, grime, and poverty of everyday human existence, the narrative forcefully emphasizes humility and radical inclusion. It's telling a story of the divine entering the world not from the top down, but from the bottom up.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to really chew on. Think about the stark contrast between the history we've just uncovered and the culture around us today. How does knowing the gritty, historically accurate truth change the way you look at those perfect, quiet, pristine nativity scenes this season? Because when we strip away the myths, the actual historical reality reveals a narrative that is far more challenging, subversive, and profoundly rooted in the real struggles of everyday life. Thank you so much for joining me to explore these incredible historical sources today. Keep asking those big questions and keep looking deeper.